Good morning to you all. Happy Sabbath. I send you greetings from all of the blessed pastors of the Upper Columbia Conference. I do want to say, I've spent a few years amongst these people, and over the past meetings that I had this week, seldom have I seen this wonderful group of dedicated men and women seem as low and discouraged as I had this past week. A lot of things going on in their personal lives, or things going on in their church. COVID catastrophes seem to be striking them left and right. Remember the pastors of this conference in your prayers this week. I know they need it. I thank you very much for those of you that have been praying for our wonderful daughter, Gemma. She has been showing some improvements after her appointments. She gained some weight this past week. It is good to be able to measure your prayers in ounces. It is a blessing. I thank Kim for putting these up here. It's no good when you're thirsty, is it? When you know you really need it. And that the things around you, you've been drinking all sorts of things, but that it doesn't really make a difference until you've had water, right? Soda, juice, even Gatorade, they're not quite going to touch it like water does. And in Luke chapter 19, the first 10 verses is where we're going to be. You see a man who is thirsty, and that nothing seems to have satisfied him in his life. While you're searching that out, I can recall recently I was with a group of young people, some teenagers and college students who were singing this beautiful, beautiful songs, and amongst them was this song I hadn't heard, and just in the words, just repeatedly, they were saying, "When I look into the face of my enemy, I see my brother." What a beautiful reminder it was of Jesus' call to love those people, especially those that we count as our enemies. And that when we look at the people in our lives, especially the inconvenient and the aggravating ones, what do you see? What's going through your head when you look at them? It's just a little food for thought as we journey down into this. He, first verse there, being Jesus, by the way, entered Jericho and was passing through it. A man was there named Zacchaeus, and he was a chief tax collector and was rich. Just stay vigilant on these sermons of mine. Stop frequently. Jesus is just going along his way. He travels around the country. He speaks the good news of the kingdom wherever he finds it. He enters Jericho. Jericho is a big city at the time, really big. It's a place where a lot of trade is happening. So you have a lot of money in this big economic center. Ellen White describes it as being a beautiful city. Fountains and greenery everywhere, and the Middle East, that's not exactly a guarantee when you're in the desert. A beautiful city, and inside of it there is a man named Zacchaeus. You're familiar with him. You remember as a child, you sing the song, you can't even hear his name without that song going through right now. Admit it. So the first details we get about Zacchaeus, two things. He is a chief tax collector. We talked a bit about tax collectors last week, so I won't beleaguer us too much with the historical details. Suffice it to say that these are people who work for the oppressive government of Rome, who rules over God's people. He would have been viewed as a traitor. People would have hated the sight of Zacchaeus. He would have been excluded from community, from church, from their synagogue in his case. The temple would have potentially been a dangerous place even for him to go. And he's in charge of the tax collectors. This isn't just the guy who is a tax collector. He's a chief tax collector. He's some sort of overseer of these people. He's worked his way up. And he's rich. Now, many times in our culture we view being rich, right, as an advantage. You don't have to worry about as much when you have a guarantee of money. In Luke's gospel, it tends to be that if you are rich, you find yourself in trouble. Seldom do we see the rich doing really well throughout Luke's gospel. In fact, they seem to be the most spiritually needy people that we encounter throughout the Gospel of Luke. And right there is where we find Zacchaeus. He's a chief tax collector. He's probably lives his life devoid of community. There's a chance, and we'll talk about this later, that he himself is engaging in some unethical or shady business dealings to increase this wealth. We don't know exactly how he's getting the money, but being a chief tax collector, we have a pretty good idea because these were people who would skim off the top. So, Jesus is in town. Zacchaeus lives there. We're getting ready for an encounter of a lifetime. And Zacchaeus, he was trying to see who Jesus was, but on account of the crowd he could not because he was short in stature. There's some grammatical issues there because English is funny, right? Who's short? Right? He couldn't see Jesus because he was short. And honestly, in the Greek, it seems to be suggesting that Zacchaeus is short. Why is Luke, who does not describe Jesus, spending time describing Zacchaeus? There is no good answer out there. I just wanted to point out that there's a big question here. There's this physical description, and that part of it seems to be that if you were short, some of you may call it vertically challenged, there was a means of looking down on you, right? And so we see height usually was affiliated in this culture as being a grandiose person. You see throughout the Bible that people who are tall automatically are looked at as being people of leadership and authority. And when you see somebody who isn't tall, it seems to be leaning into this idea that, well, he's just some little guy. He's a tax collector. What does he matter? And what is particularly interesting is there at the beginning of verse 3, he was trying to see Jesus because he wanted to see who Jesus was. He was trying to see who he was. Is Jesus this well-known rabbi? He's probably at the height of his fame at this time, who's passing through his town. Is this Jesus, this rabbi, is he like all the other Pharisees and Sadducees, all the other rabbis that Zacchaeus has ever encountered, the people who look down on him, the people that have encouraged the community to exclude and distance themselves from him, to separate him out from the community? Is this guy Jesus? Is he like the systems of exclusion and sin that he has been exposed to his whole life? The ones that said you're not good enough for God and he doesn't care about you. That because of who you are and what you did, you're no longer part of our community and we want nothing more to do with you. Or is Jesus different? Is he different from all the hurt and the pain that Zacchaeus has experienced in his life? This has to be a question that he is experiencing as he too wants to see this famous rabbi who's going around and doing amazing, spectacular things in his country. And so he ran ahead and he climbed a sycamore tree to see him because he was going to pass that way. Zacchaeus knows the town, right? It's his hometown. You know kind of the route people are going to take, what the most obvious ways to get around. And Luke, by the way, throughout Luke and his other book, Acts, is kind of well known for these little humorous quips because remember, running was not easy in robes. So you see this little man scurrying about, a wealthy man too, so his robes were probably more ornate and not necessarily as limber as you would want in exercise clothing, scurrying up towards this tree, and to think, what's the best way to see? I can't stay here and wait for the crowd to trample me. They'll probably just push me off to the side. I know, Zacchaeus thinks to himself, I'll climb up the tree. And you've seen a sycamore tree, right? These big, giant ones, they're not hard to climb. Might be more difficult in a robe again, but not impossible. And up he shimmies. Why? Because he wants to see Jesus. More than he cares about looking good or being dignified, that's what his main goal is. And that he's willing to do what it takes to just catch a glimpse of him. And when Jesus came to the place, he looked up and said to him, we'll get to that in a second. Can't you just see it? Jesus is walking along. He's got a good trajectory going, momentum, even though the crowd is probably, making it difficult to move around. He's navigating right to the spot, and Zacchaeus is just there. Oh, he's going to come. He's going to come right this way. Imagine the excitement, maybe a little bit of nerves rolling around in that little body. And as Jesus passes that way, he stops. How odd that would have been to the people around him. He was headed somewhere, surely, they thought. And he stops and just... And you must imagine the rest of the crowd follows his eye up. What could possibly be up there? And there you see him. Zacchaeus. You know him. He's a part of your town. He's a part of the regular things that you have to do to recognize that there's an empire with its boots sitting squarely on your neck. And you think, this is the perfect moment. He's going to get it. Jesus is going to give him what for? And Jesus, as he looks up, imagine what Zacchaeus must be feeling. You ever have those moments when all eyes are directly on you? When the crowd, all of a sudden, you didn't mean for them to be looking at you, but then attention turned right your way. Even those of us that don't have stage fright feel a little uncomfortable in those moments. And Jesus opens his mouth and says, Zacchaeus, hurry and come down, for I must stay at your house today. This is a big deal, brothers and sisters. Enormous, huge deal going on here. Because when a rabbi in Jesus' day, when any Jewish person said to you, I'd like for us to have a meal together. It wasn't just a pleasantry. It wasn't just, a nice thing that we said and we kind of hoped that they would say no. It had a very particular meaning. You weren't going to waste resources in a culture where you didn't know necessarily sometimes where the next meal was coming from. Is that this was for the purpose of saying, you and I are going to eat together because my desire is for us to enter into a relationship. I want you and I to be friends. is what Jesus is saying to Zacchaeus, and the crowd would have been scandalized. This rabbi is looking up at not just a tax collector, at the chief tax collector. And he says to, and for some reason, who is up in a tree, who is, even if he's not sinful, is probably insane, and calling him into a relationship with him, to be his friend. What an enormous deal this is for Zacchaeus, who spent so much of his life on the outside. Jesus is calling him into a direct relationship with him. This is beyond his wildest dreams. Zacchaeus was just hoping, right, to just see a glimpse of Jesus, just catch a little snippet of him as he passed underneath the tree. He was not expecting that Jesus was going to come by and look up at him and call him out of this life and into a new one. But he does. And Zacchaeus is left with what all of us are left with when we encounter the living Jesus, and that is a choice. He can stay in the tree, or he can do what he does. And he comes down. And he doesn't just come down slow, right? So he hurried down and was happy to welcome him. All who saw it began to grumble, and they said, "He has gone to be the guest of one who is a sinner." All the people around Jesus do not see the extraordinary moment of grace that Jesus is pouring out on this poor, lost man. All they see is the sin. They miss out on Jesus doing something spectacular, and instead they sit and they grumble that Jesus should be gracious to a sinner. I love that Zacchaeus hurries down the tree. You ever climbed a tree? Let me rephrase that. You ever fallen out of a tree? His primary focus is just wanting to be with Jesus, to just enter into this new relationship that he's being called to. And when he hears the people all around him grumbling, Zacchaeus stood there, and he said to the Lord, Look, half of all my possessions, Lord, I will give to the poor. And if I have defrauded anyone, anything, I will pay back 4 times as much. And there is an important debate that is occurring amongst many theologians as I was reading and preparing for this. And there are 2 schools of thought here. One is that in encountering Jesus, Zacchaeus becomes fully aware of the fact that he has cheated people, that he did wrong as a tax collector, and that when Jesus calls him into this relationship, he recognizes that these are things that he has to leave behind, that he can't go on being a follower of Jesus and a thief. And that is true, right? We need to put those things behind us and step forward into the new life Jesus is calling us to. And he gives half of it to the poor. Now, I recognize that it is the Sabbath, and so I will not ask you to do too much math here. The other end of the spectrum argues, though, that this could be Zacchaeus defending himself. Maybe he didn't steal from people. There is, in fact, some record, ancient records, that there was at some point some sort of monument to what they called an honest tax collector. That it was possible Perhaps some people thought it was a course of their personal duty to be able to step in and say, we aren't going to cheat people. We're going to try and treat people fairly on this. If Rome's going to do this to us, it may as well be somebody who's treating people fairly. And if he says, if I stole from anybody, you can come to me and I'll give you 4 times what I took. How is this possible if he is routinely and constantly stealing from people? Here's the thing, no matter where we find ourselves on this debate, Zacchaeus is still a sinner. Zacchaeus is still somebody who is mired in a world of sin and is in need of Jesus' rescue. It doesn't matter when I hear the debate, because Zacchaeus still is in need of the grace that only Jesus can provide to set him free from whatever chain it is that the devil strives to clench onto his wrists. Amen. And we recognize that Jesus doesn't seem to care about the debate either. Because in verse 9, then Jesus said to him, "Today salvation has come to this house, because he too is a son of Abraham." He too is the heir of a promise that God made to rescue his people from their sins, of the plan that was enacted to bless the whole world. For the Son of Man came to seek out and to save the lost. I have a friend who is a pastor, and he describes one of his main spiritual gifts as eavesdropping. And he says, I was sitting at the airport, which, you do a lot of at the airport. You sit in that chair and you pretend that there is a comfortable position while you're waiting for your plane to get there. And he says, I was sitting there, and over in front of me, because the rows kind of face each other, there was a man and his small boy was with him. And the boy was looking out the window, right? Those big giant windows as the planes are coming in and parking, and you can watch them taking off and wishing you were on them. And the boy was just transfixed, his hands way up on the glass, just looking amazed. And he said to his dad, "Daddy, how is that done? How do they do that?" And he says, "Well, there's a man in there, and he's the pilot. And he knows, he's got the training, and he's learned how to fly the airplanes." And the boy says, "Oh, that's amazing." He says, "Daddy, do you think that someday I could be a pilot? And that I could go and I could fly planes, these big giant things, which for some reason are able to stay up there." He said, "Oh, that would be so amazing. I'd love it, Daddy, if I could learn how to fly planes." He says, "Do you think I could be a pilot?" And his dad says, "Of course." He says, it takes a lot of study for people to learn how to fly planes, and they work really hard, the pilots, and they're very dedicated people who had to study and practice and learn and do all these things." He tells his son, and he says, "Oh, I promise, Daddy. I promise that I'd be a great pilot. I'd work really hard, and I'd learn all the things, and I'd go to school, and I'd study, and I'd do all the things it would take to be a pilot." He said, "Oh, when I grow up, what a wonderful thing it'll be to be a pilot." He says, as he was sitting there, he heard the boy look over his father. He said, "Daddy, what did you want to be when you were little? When you were growing up? What did you always want to be?" He says, "Oh, I'd love to be a pilot, but what's the thing that made you long for? What did you really want to do?" And the dad looked at his son, and he said, "My whole life, all I ever wanted to be was your daddy." Man, what an answer! That Jesus' whole life, the whole reason that he came into this world, was to seek out and save those poor, lost children of his. that he desires so greatly to be part of his family, to extend that wonderful gift. When you look at people in your life, you got a sibling who is a pain in the neck, that neighbor who can't seem to utter a word that is outside of the register that we call a grumble, that person at work who's constantly undermining you, the person in front of you as you leave here today that's driving just a little too slow. When we look out on the people who make us angry and the people who we delight in, what do you see? There's two answers to that, right? There's the thing that is the knee-jerk response. Well, I see this person who's just such a pain, and they're so aggravating, and they do all these things. But there's also the other answer that we need to hold really tightly to, and I think that the story of Zacchaeus is calling us to, which is that when we look at our neighbors, Gary's been talking a lot about going out and meeting the people nearby. When we look at the people all around us, the good, the bad, the ugly, what it is calling us to see is people who Jesus is profoundly in love with, and that who he desires to have a relationship with. That all around us, every day we are encountering people who Jesus is longing for and working to call into a saving relationship with himself. And what I am reminded of is if that is true of every person I encounter in my life, what does that mean about me? It means just the same thing. That I am someone who the King of the universe desires to have a relationship with. Now, that's something I can cling to that could be the ultimate bias over my life. And that I can look out onto this world and continue to strive to look past the things that irritate me, that annoy me, that strive to make anger the name of the game in my life, and to look at the people around me as people who Jesus desires deeply to have a relationship with. May that be the call that Jesus has on each one of us as we go throughout our lives, today, tomorrow, throughout this week, throughout the rest of our lives. May we have no peace until we learn this lesson. That these are people who are lost and who Jesus wants in his family. May it be so for all of us as we look out and choose to love people like Jesus loves people. Let's pray. Jesus, we just thank you so much that you welcome us into your family. That surely we know we don't have it all together here. But Jesus, we just want to stand here today and praise you for that wonderful gift that you give us of being sons and daughters of the kingdom. Jesus, may you open our eyes to look out on the wounded and hurting people all around us and to see people you love. Amen. Happy Sabbath.